Good morning, Woodland. Welcome back to our third session of Arrested Development. It's our summer series where we've been talking about faith. Faith that is dynamic, faith that is growing, faith that's on the move. This morning we talked about stage 3 in faith development. And I think back upon a time when I was a student at Baylor. I was taking a theology class with Dr. C.W. Christian. And in that class, Dr. Christian announced one morning that we were all going to be assigned a paper, and we're going to be assigned a book in the Bible from which to write that paper. That is, that we were supposed to find all the theological themes in that particular book and write a paper upon them. Well, he opened his grade book, and then he assigned books to various students. And when he got to me, he gave me the book of Jonah. And at first, I was perplexed, and then I got downright mad about it. I mean, Jonah, come on. It's a children's story. It's a fable. I got so worked up that I went in to see Dr. Christian. And I said, Dr. Christian, this is a children's story. There's no theology in that book. And in his smiling sort of way, he said, there's all kinds of theology in that book. And then he raised an eyebrow and he said, you know, the book of Jonah was an important book for Jesus. And he said, if it was important for Jesus, don't you think it ought to be important for you? What do you say to that? I just backed out of his office, nodding, and I went to the library to see what I could find about the book of Jonah. Well, it didn't take long for me to discover that all my assumptions about Jonah were wrong. That Jonah was full of all kinds of interesting things. But the most interesting thing for me in that particular book was a little line that came after the Ninevites had repented. They put on their sackcloth and ashes and said, we were wrong, we're sorry. Jonah goes back to God, and God says to Jonah, listen, Jonah, well done. I've changed my mind. I'm not going to destroy Nineveh. Well, you know the rest of the story. But that particular line astounded me. Can God change his mind? Wow. I began looking in the Bible and looked for other places where God might change his mind. Well, there's Genesis, where Abraham is in Sodom and Gomorrah, and God has decided to destroy both of those cities. And Abraham says, listen, if I can go and find 20 or 30 good men, will you relent? And God says, okay. And he couldn't find 20 or 30. He said, well, how about 10? And he kept bargaining with God, and we know the story. But what's interesting to me is the fact that God bargained with Abraham. Then again, there's a more emphatic statement that happens in the Exodus experience. Moses has come down off the mountain of Sinai with the 10 Commandments, and he finds the children of Israel in the valley dancing and worshiping a golden calf. Moses gets so angry that he hurls the 10 Commandments and destroys the golden calf. That's another story altogether. But he marches back up the mountain. And there he finds God, and God is very angry. In fact, so angry that God says, Moses, I've had it with these people. I'm going to start all over. It's just going to be you and me. And Moses stops and intervenes for the children of Israel. He said, whoa, you're right, God. What they did was terrible. But at heart, they're really good people. Will you give them a second chance? Well, the fact that you and I are here this morning is the fact that God gave them a second chance. And then in the New Testament, in that autobiographical story of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus begs God 3 times, Lord, if it just be your will, would you take this cup from my hand? Now, why would Jesus ask God that question if he didn't think that God might change his mind? Well, stage 3 development talks about change in a drastic sort of way. This morning, we see that in the person of Simon Peter, how Easter changed everything about the man.
Good morning. I would suppose my name gives me away. Simon Peter, Rocky. I like to think of myself as solid as a rock. No doubts, no questions, no hesitation. But you might have picked up on the past tense here. I was all of those things and more until things came to a head on that fateful weekend in Jerusalem. It started innocently enough, a holiday dinner party given by Jesus. The rest of the guys were a bit nervous with all of the rumors swirling about what might happen to Jesus. Even Jesus himself insinuated that things were about to turn on him, that he was to be betrayed and then arrested. It panicked everyone, but not me. While there were whimpering, "Is it I?" I bellowed, "I would never betray you," and I will never forget the penetrating eyes of Jesus when he said to me, "Rocky, you'll betray me 3 times before the cock crows in the morning." I said to him, and rather gruffly, I had to say, "No way, not a chance, not me." He just looked at me sadly and shook his head and gave me a look that etched itself on my consciousness. I won't ever forget it. But sure enough, he was right. That night was the beginning of a litany of betrayals. Several occasions when I acted as if I didn't know him, from his arrest, his trial, and then his being led away to his crucifixion. I will confess that I didn't go to his crucifixion. All I could think about was what the Romans usually did to a revolutionary and his supporters. They crucified him and all who followed. I wasn't the terrorist I thought I might be. I was the terrified, and I ran like a frightened animal. All of us did, with the exception of John and the women. They stayed close to Jesus through it all. Boy, did I misread my friend John. I thought he would run at the first sign of trouble, but I was wrong. He stuck with Jesus through it all. Me? I took to the hills and hid all that day and night, finally rendezvousing with the others the next day. It seemed that Pilate, for whatever reason, didn't pursue those of us who had followed Jesus. Nonetheless, just to be sure, we hid out in the room where we had dined a couple of nights before. We didn't talk all that much. I retreated to a corner and just pulled my cloak over my head. I was so ashamed. I questioned not just my manhood, but my very existence. Minutes turned torturously into hours, then into the night. The women brought food, but I couldn't eat or sleep. It was awful. All night long, I kept questioning myself. Who was I? Who did I think I was? Why did I give in so easily? What was going to become of me? That dark night of the soul broke the next morning, not because of some personal illumination, but from the raucousness of Mary Magdalene. I never wanted to be around her much, and to be honest, I found her presence in the room early that morning to be distasteful. She was so loud, so forceful, claiming that she had seen Jesus. I never trusted her, and her antics that morning did nothing to dissuade that opinion. Her actions were so offensive to me and everyone else. We all turned away, but she said directly to me, "Simon, of all people, you need to come." She didn't call me Rocky. It was as if she was making a point of my cowardice. I growled at her, but it didn't put her off. In fact, when I gave her a second look, I noticed that her gaze at me wasn't disrespect, it was beckoning. In that moment, I recognized that she wasn't trying to draw attention to herself. Something was going on. John noticed it too. "Rocky, let's go. It can't hurt." I got up and followed them out. We started with a slow walk, then broke into a jog that became a full run. John was running faster than I'd ever seen him run. It was no time at all before he left me behind, and I had no idea how far behind Mary Magdalene was. When I finally caught up with John, he was at the tomb, standing outside, but not frightened, not perplexed, just waiting. My impulsivity didn't halt me. I just bolted to the door, not pausing in the least. Didn't consider it strange that the tomb's door had been rolled out of the way. Immediately I noticed Jesus' robe laying on the doorway. John saw it too, but held back, looking at me, wondering. Without thinking, I just went in. Jesus' body wasn't there, only the linen shroud that had wrapped his head. And funny, but not in a humorous way, the shroud looked as if the person inside had just vanished into thin air. I turned and ran away, only this time it wasn't in fear of the Romans. It was the run of someone completely discombobulated, someone running in all directions at once. I took off for the hills, wondering what in heaven's name had happened. I don't know how far I ran until he caught up with me. And I'm not talking about John. I won't tell you all that happened, but it was in that moment that everything began to change for me. It was in that moment that my certainties gave way to questions that gave way to wonderings and wanderings that have mystified those who knew me and magnified a faith I was still trying to comprehend. That experience has changed me forever. My life is no longer one of orthodoxy that afforded no difference of opinion about faith, but curiosity about a reality that there is more going on than I could ever imagine. I received a newfound confidence, not so much in the arrogant staunchness of my past, but a resolute boldness inspired in me by Jesus, the Christ. There, I said it, the Christ. Now, what do you think about that? Truly, what do you think about that?
Thank you, Simon Peter. You know, stage 3 faith is a dramatic, remarkable experience. It's freeing, but it's also a bit harrowing because it changes everything about who you are, about how you see things, how you see God. It makes you welcome all the questions that you have, knowing that God is going to welcome those questions God's self. It makes you realize that doubt and questioning leads to greater faith. And it makes J.B. Phillips' old statement so very, very true. Your God is too small. Stage 3 faith realizes that our God, our perception of God, is way too small. Your teachers have some questions for you to talk about your view of God and how that has changed. Enjoy.